I was never the kind of person who believed in miracles or spiritual experiences. My name is Stephanie, and I have always been proud of being independent, of not needing anyone. I grew up watching my mother struggle alone to raise me after my father abandoned us, without even looking back. From a very young age, I learned that trusting others was a mistake, and that, in the end, the only person I could rely on was myself. This shaped my personality in such a way that, for a long time, I believed it to be my greatest strength. Not only did I avoid relying on anyone, but I also despised the idea of needing anything beyond what I could see and touch. Faith, spirituality, that was for the weak, for those who needed something to lean on because they couldn't face life head on. At least, that was what I believed until that night. It was an ordinary night. After a long day at work, I got home and noticed that a lamp in the hallway was burned out. Without thinking much, I grabbed a ladder and climbed up to change it. This wasn't the first time I had done this. After all, I always handled everything on my own. But this time something went wrong. Maybe it was the slippery floor. Maybe I lost my balance. In an instant, I felt my body falling, and the next moment, my head hit the ground hard. A dry crack filled my ears before everything went dark. There was no pain, just an absolute silence, as if I had been disconnected from the world. In the blink of an eye, when I opened my eyes, it took me a few seconds to understand what was happening. There was something strange, something out of place. That's when I realized I was watching myself. My body lay sprawled on the living room floor, motionless. My face looked too pale, eyes closed, and for some reason, I couldn't feel my own chest rising and falling with each breath. I wanted to run to my body. I wanted to get up, but when I tried to move, I noticed I felt no weight. I didn't feel the ground beneath my feet. Was I dreaming? It must be, but it felt so real. I could see the door of my house being forced open. The neighbors must have heard the noise from the fall and called for an ambulance. I saw the paramedics arrive, murmuring orders with their muffled voices, as if they were too far away despite being right there. One of them checked my pulse and shook his head. Another began to perform compressions on my chest, but I felt nothing. I was just watching. Time seemed to fold in on itself. In one moment I was there, witnessing the frantic efforts of the doctors to bring me back to life, and in the next, everything disappeared. I was pulled away from that place, as if someone had yanked a rug from beneath my feet, thrown into a space where nothing existed. And when I say nothing, I don't mean just darkness. It was the absence of everything. No sound, no shape, no smell, not even the sensation of having, just a deep, absolute void. I tried to scream. I tried to run. I tried anything that would make me feel real, but there was no echo, no response. It was at that moment that I felt something I had never felt in life, an overwhelming vulnerability. For the first time, I had no control. For the first time, I was completely alone. Time did not exist there. I knew that seconds, minutes, or hours had passed. All I had was that oppressive feeling of being lost in something I could not comprehend. It was then that I heard it. At first, it was just low, distant whispers, as if they were coming from all directions at once. I focused, trying to understand, but the words slipped away, blending into the void. Then they started to become clearer. You hid behind the fortress, but it was fear. You clung to what was safe. With each phrase, I felt an invisible weight. The layers of protection I had built throughout my life exposing something I did not want to face. I didn't know what would happen to me. Could this be the end? Panic began to rise, tightening my existence like an invisible hand around what was left of me. But before I could be completely engulfed by despair, something changed. A presence, at first just a subtle sensation, like a gentle breeze passing through the nothingness. But then the light came. Small at first, almost like a distant point, but it grew quickly. It expanded and encompassed everything, sweeping away the darkness as if it had never existed. I should have felt relieved, but instead, a wave of dread washed over me because, for the first time in my life, I had no idea what was about to happen. The light grew until there was no trace of emptiness around me, but this light was not just a glow. It had a presence. It was alive, enveloping, and carried with it something I had never felt before, a peace so profound that it seemed to dissolve all my defenses without me having to fight it. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to resist. It was as if a part of me, buried beneath years of distrust and control, was finally free to breathe. It was then that I saw, amidst the light, a figure beginning to take shape. First a contour, then more defined feature. When I realized who was there, my body, or what had once been me, froze in that moment. It was him. I didn't need anyone to tell me. There was no doubt. Somehow, I knew. Jesus was standing before me, but he wasn't like the images I had seen in churches or books. His presence was something I couldn't fully comprehend, yet it enveloped me in a way I couldn't ignore. He didn't need to speak for me to understand that he knew everything about me. Every thought, every resentment, every barrier I had built throughout my life to protect myself. His gaze pierced through all the masks I believed were unbreakable, and for the first time, I found myself completely vulnerable. I wanted to look away. I wanted to hide, but it was impossible in front of him. I felt as if all the layers I had accumulated over my life had been stripped away all at once. There was no pride, no resistance, just me. For the first time, I saw myself as I really was, without the distortions of anger, fear, or skepticism. And it was in that moment when the images began to appear around me. They formed like living projections in the air. I saw my mother crying alone in the room, believing no one was watching her, that no one cared. I saw the younger version of myself, absorbing her disdainful words about men. I saw the years pass, the moments when I chose to push away anyone who tried to get too close, just to avoid the risk of being hurt. And then, something I had never considered before began to emerge. Other images, other memories I had ignored. I saw the neighbor who always helped my mother without asking for anything in return, just out of kindness. I saw my teacher from school, the one who encouraged me to believe in myself, who saw potential where I only saw obligation. I saw a classmate holding the elevator door for me, a stranger on the street helping me carry heavy boxes. They were small gestures I never wanted to recognize as part of a greater reality. Why admit that there was goodness in men would mean admitting that my view of the world was wrong. And in that moment, I knew I had never chosen to be strong. I had chosen to be afraid. The impact of that revelation hit me like a hammer. I had spent my entire life convinced that my strength came from my independence, from my refusal to need anyone, especially men. But now, before those scenes, I saw clearly that my strength was not real. It was just a wall I built to protect myself from something I never truly wanted to face. And then the scene changed. I saw my father not as the cold and distant figure I had carried with me all those years, but as an older man, alone, sitting in a small room, hands covering his face. He was crying, and there, without words, without explanations, I knew he regretted it. My first instinct was to reject that. I wanted to scream that he didn't deserve compassion, that he deserved nothing from me. But before I could cling to that old resentment, Jesus spoke. It was the first time he broke the silence. His voice was firm, but filled with a love that pierced me like a purifying fire. Forgive. Because in that moment, I understood that what he was asking of me was not just an act of kindness towards my father. It was the key to my own liberation. Because as long as I held on to the hatred within me, I would not be free. I wanted to resist. I wanted to say it wasn't that simple. But before I could cling to those justifications, it was as if a crack opened inside me, as if all that hatred, that unyielding conviction that I would never grant him that privilege, began to crumble before the truth I could no longer deny. My father wasn't a monster. He was a flawed man, a man who made wrong choices, who ran away from what he should have faced, but now bore the weight of those decisions. And in that moment, I felt something I never imagined I could feel for him. Not justification, not excuses, but a genuine understanding that he was just as broken as I was. And then I realized that forgiveness wasn't about absolving. It was about freeing myself. I looked at Jesus, and he didn't need to say anything more. His gaze said it all. He was offering me a choice. I could continue to hold on to that weight, letting it define my life forever, or I could let it go. I could choose freedom. And there, in that space where time and reality didn't exist the way I knew them, I made my decision. I forgive, I said, and the moment those words left me, something happened. I felt a weight I hadn't even known I was carrying being pulled from my soul, as if invisible chains were breaking. It was as if hate, pain, resentment, everything I had nurtured for so long vanished, and in its place was something new, something I had never experienced before. Not a momentary peace, but something that felt rooted in a deep place within me that nothing could take away. But my journey was not yet over. I felt that something else needed to happen, something I still didn't understand, before I could ask, before I could even form a thought. I felt reality around me unfold once more. The light didn't fade, but I was thrown into another place. There was no emptiness or projections of my life surrounding me. The grass stretched out everywhere, a deep green that seemed almost alive. It was as if the light itself had substance, as if there were no sun, but everything emitted its own glow. The wind blew gently, and in the air was a fragrance that reminded me of something between flowers and running water. Every detail felt more real than anything I had ever felt before. And then I heard his voice again. It's not your time yet. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel a desperate silence. I didn't want to go back. I didn't want to leave that peace, that love, that absolute certainty that everything made sense. But before I could argue, Jesus came closer, looked at me, and in that gaze was the answer to everything I still didn't understand. There's something you need to do. I didn't need to ask what it was. I knew. And that's when everything began to fade away. Back to where it all began, the feeling of peace remained. But the reality around me changed suddenly. Suddenly there was a jolt, something cold, something heavy, a distant sound, muffled voices. Then came the pain. A crushing weight fell on me and my lungs burned, as if they were igniting in fire. It was then that I realized I had returned. The pain was ravenous. My eyes snapped open, and everything seemed confusing. White lights, blurry faces, voices calling my name. My body felt heavy, as if it had been yanked from some far-off place and thrown back into something too small to contain all that I had felt. My head throbbed, and each breath felt like a superhuman effort. It was only when I felt fingers pressing on my pulse and a familiar face leaning over me that I understood where I was. The hospital. I was alive. But before I could process anything, tears began streaming down my face. I didn't know if it was relief, confusion, or nostalgia for what I had left behind. All I knew was that something inside me had changed forever. In the following days, I tried to convince myself that all of that was just an illusion created by trauma. The doctor said I was clinically dead for 8 minutes. 8 minutes. And according to them, during that time, my brain probably created images to comfort me, to fill the void of unconsciousness. But I knew it wasn't like that. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a delusion. I was there. I saw. I felt. And more than that, I returned different. Before, I would have laughed at the idea of a spiritual experience. I would have dismissed it all as an invention of a mind desperate to find meaning. But it wasn't like that. I didn't just see something. I was transformed in the days that followed. The reality of what I had lived began to weigh on me in a different way. Fear was no longer about admitting what had happened, but rather how I was going to handle it moving forward. How could I continue living the same way? After having seen the truth with my own eyes, how could I simply ignore everything he showed me? But there was something that tormented me even more, the promise I made. I had chosen forgiveness. I had chosen to trust him. And if I simply left that behind, what was the point of it all? So, when I realized that it wasn't enough just to have lived that experience, I needed to act accordingly, and I knew exactly where to start. The phone had been in my hand for several minutes, and I couldn't dial. My heart was beating so hard that I could feel each pulse deep in my chest, but I knew I had to do it. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath before finally pressing the call button. The line rang only 3 times before someone answered, and then a voice I hadn't heard in years filled the silence. My father. For a moment, everything I wanted to say vanished from my mind. I thought about hanging up right then and pretending I had never tried, but I could no longer keep living in fear. So, with a trembling voice, I said the only thing that mattered. I forgive you. The silence on the other end of the line seemed to last an eternity. For a moment, I feared he would just hang up, that he wouldn't care and would carry on as if nothing had happened. But then I heard a muffled sob. He tried to say something, but his voice cracked, choked by emotion. "Forgive me, daughter, forgive me." Those words washed over me like a wave, and for the first time, not out of anger, not out of pain, but for something I had never allowed myself to feel. Relief. It wasn't about forgetting the past. It wasn't about pretending the wounds never existed. But in that moment, I understood what Jesus had wanted me to grasp all along. From that day on, nothing was ever the same. I remain independent, I remain strong, but now that strength doesn't come from resistance, fear, or pride. It comes from the peace that can only exist when we let go of what binds us. I began to study the Bible, to seek to understand more about God and what He wanted for my life. And no matter how new this path is for me, I know one thing. I will never be alone again. I went to the other side, saw the truth with my own eyes, and if I can leave something for you who are reading this story now, it's this. God's love and forgiveness are real. You can deny it, you can run away, you can build all the walls in the world to protect yourself. But the truth is, He has always been there, waiting for you. The choice was always yours, just as it was mine. And you, what would you do if you had an experience like this? Do you think near-death experiences are real or just a product of the mind? I would love to know your opinion. Leave your comment down below and share your thoughts on what we've just heard. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way you won't miss any new content that could transform your view of life and what lies beyond it. This is very important for us to keep bringing stories like this to you. Now, if you want to hear another amazing story about someone who went through an extraordinary experience, click on the next video that's already on the screen. You won't want to miss it. See you in the next video. Goodbye.